The week before Christmas, my son called to tell me I wasn't welcome at his table. Not in those exact words. Nathan had always been careful with his words, the way a man is careful when he's rehearsed something long enough to make it sound reasonable. He said Diana thought it would be better if we gave everyone some space this year. He said the kids were at that age where too many people in the house made things stressful. He said it calmly, the way you'd reschedule a dentist appointment. And when I asked him directly, "Is your wife the reason I'm not coming?" there was a pause that answered everything. I drove to Portland 6 months before that call, sold the house in Columbus where I'd raised my children, packed what I could fit into a moving truck, and followed the vague promise of a smaller life that asked less of me. My daughter Claire had called it brave. My son had called it impulsive. What it actually was, I didn't have a word for yet. I was 61 years old, recently retired, and I had the strange feeling that I'd been living someone else's story for decades and had finally walked off the wrong set. So that Christmas Eve, I sat in a diner near my apartment, a small booth by the window, the kind with vinyl seats that creak when you shift your weight. The place was called Maze, and it smelled like cinnamon rolls and old coffee. I'd ordered the Christmas special without reading what it was, and when it arrived I stared at it for a long moment before I realized I wasn't actually hungry. I was 62 years old, and I was eating Christmas dinner alone in a booth for two, 3 tables away. A woman I guessed to be around 70 was watching me. Not rudely, the way you watch someone when you recognize something in them. She had silver hair pinned up loosely and reading glasses pushed to the top of her head, and when I met her eyes she didn't look away. She smiled instead, the kind of smile that doesn't require anything back. Her name was Margaret. She told me that later, after she walked over to my table without hesitation and asked, very simply, whether I'd like to come sit with her family. Not would you like some company or you look lonely. Dear, she just pulled out the chair across from me, tilted her head toward her table, and said, "We've got more food than 4 people can finish, and it seems a shame to waste it on leftovers." I said yes. I don't know why exactly. Some combination of exhaustion and gratitude and the simple animal need to sit near other human beings who were glad to be there. Her husband Howard stood up when I walked over and shook my hand firmly, the way men of a certain generation shake hands when they actually mean it. Their son-in-law Paul poured me a glass of wine without being asked. Their daughter Kathleen asked my name and used it 3 times in the first 10 minutes, the way people do when they want you to feel real. I thought it was a one-time kindness, the kind you accept with gratitude and remember fondly and never expect to repeat. I was wrong about that, but I didn't know it yet. What I knew, sitting at that table on Christmas Eve while snow pressed quietly against the diner windows, was that something in my chest that had been locked for a very long time had just cracked open the smallest amount, and the air coming through felt like something I'd forgotten the name of. The call from my son came 3 weeks into the new year. January, gray and cold. The kind of Portland morning where the sky looks like it's never heard of sunlight. I was unpacking the last of my boxes. I'd been in the apartment 4 months and still hadn't finished, which tells you something about my state of mind when my phone rang and Nathan's name appeared on the screen. He'd heard about the house sale, he said. He knew I'd walked away with money. He was careful about how he phrased it, the way he always was. But underneath the careful phrasing was a structure I recognized. He was building toward something. "Diana and I have been looking at property," he said. "An investment opportunity. Something that would set us up long term." He talked for 4 minutes about interest rates and market windows, and a development outside Nashville that a friend of his had already gotten in on. And then, at the end of all that, he said the number, $80,000. He said he needed it within 60 days. I asked him if he'd spoken to a financial advisor. The pause after that question had a temperature to it. "Dad," he said, and his voice shifted. "I'm not asking for advice. I'm asking for help. You have the money. You've always had it. The only difference is now you don't have a mortgage to hide behind." I told him I'd think about it, which was a coward's answer, and I knew it even as I said it, but I wasn't ready yet. I was still trying to understand what had happened to the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long drives, and the man on the phone who talked to me like I was a business negotiation he was running out of patience with. That same evening, I did something I hadn't done since Christmas. I called Margaret. She answered on the second ring. I heard Howard in the background asking who it was. When I told her about Nathan's call, stumbling through it, not sure why I was telling her, a woman I'd known for 3 weeks, she listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Howard, put the kettle on. Robert's coming over." I hadn't said I was coming over, but I went. We sat in their kitchen, the 3 of us. And Howard asked the questions that Margaret was too polite to ask directly. Had my son called before this? Was this the first time he'd asked for something? How long had things been this way between us? I answered honestly, which was something I hadn't done with anyone about Nathan in a very long time. The answers weren't flattering to either of us. I'd been absent in ways that weren't forgivable but were at least understandable. Nathan had been resentful in ways that were understandable but had stopped being forgivable about 5 years ago. We'd reached a standoff neither of us had ever officially declared. Howard nodded slowly at everything I said. He had a quality of stillness that I found deeply calming, not passivity. More like a man who'd seen enough of the world to know which things were worth disturbing the air over. "The money isn't the issue," he said eventually. "You already know that." I did know that. I just hadn't said it out loud. "He's asking to see if you'll say yes," Margaret added. "If you say yes, he knows the terms of the relationship. If you say no, he'll be angry. But at least you'll both know where you stand." I drove home that night through the rain and sat in my car for a long time outside my building. I thought about what it would mean to write that check. Not the money itself, though the money mattered. I wasn't fooling myself about that. I thought about what it would feel like a year later, 2 years later, when Nathan called again. And he would call again, not because he was malicious, because I would have taught him what I was for. I called him the next afternoon. I told him no. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me if I understood what I was doing. I said I did. He said Diana had expected this, that she'd told him not to bother, that she'd always known I was the kind of man who put his own comfort above his family. I said I was sorry he felt that way. He said, "Sorry doesn't actually cost you anything, does it, Dad?" And then he said something that took me a moment to process. It came so quickly and with such precision, like he'd been saving it. "You walked out on us when we needed you. You sold the house we grew up in without even asking us. And now you're sitting on $80,000 in Portland, playing retired while Diana and I are trying to build something real. So don't call me anymore. As far as I'm concerned, you made your choice a long time ago, and this is just you making it again." He hung up before I could respond. I stood in the kitchen of my apartment holding the phone. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car alarm went off and then stopped. The world continued at its usual pace, and paid no attention to the fact that my son had just closed a door I hadn't realized was still open. I called Claire that evening. My daughter answered the way she always did, warmly, immediately, like she'd been waiting to hear from me. When I told her what had happened, she didn't say "I told you so," even though she could have. She'd been warning me about Nathan's patterns for years, quietly and without drama, the way Claire did everything. "Are you okay?" she asked. I told her I was, which was only partly true, but the part that was true felt solid in a way it hadn't in a long time. That Sunday I showed up at Margaret and Howard's house for dinner. I hadn't been invited specifically, but Margaret had told me once in passing that Sundays were open, that they always made too much food, that anyone who wanted to come was welcome. I brought a bottle of wine and showed up at 6 o'clock, and Howard opened the door like he'd been expecting me. "Kathleen made pot roast," he said. "You like pot roast?" I said I did. "Good. Come in." The kitchen was warm and loud in the way that homes are when people actually want to be in them. Kathleen was at the stove, arguing cheerfully with Paul about whether the gravy needed more time. Their daughter Emma, who was 9 and had her grandmother's directness, immediately told me my jacket was ugly and asked if I wanted to see her hamster. I said yes to the hamster. I followed her upstairs and she showed me a small brown creature named Captain Biscuit, who regarded me with the deep suspicion of someone who'd been burned before. "He likes you," Emma told me. I looked at the hamster's skeptical expression. "Does he? He's not running away." "That means he likes you." She said it with complete authority. "Grandma says that's how you can tell about most things. If they're not running away, they're okay with you." I thought about that for the rest of the evening. through pot roast and 2 glasses of wine and a conversation with Howard about whether Portland's winters ever got better, through dessert and Emma insisting on showing me every single photograph on the living room wall and explaining who everyone was, with the confidence of a docent at a very important museum, through the moment when Margaret touched my arm as I was putting on my jacket to leave and said, "Same time next week?" I said yes without hesitating. The weeks became months. I stopped treating Sunday dinners like a favor I was receiving and started treating them like something I was part of. I learned Howard's shorthand, the way he communicated more in a raised eyebrow than most people did in a paragraph. I learned that Margaret's cooking was an act of love in the most literal sense. She cooked the way some people pray, with focused attention and the clear belief that it mattered. I learned that Emma would tell me the truth about things that adults were too polite to mention, and that this was an extraordinary gift if you could receive it without flinching. 6 months in, I had a key to their house. Not because anyone made a ceremony of it. Howard just handed it to me one afternoon when I'd stopped by to help him fix a gutter and he'd needed to run an errand. "Just lock up if you leave before I'm back," he said. I still had that key. I kept it on the same ring as my apartment key, and for a long time that felt like the most important thing I owned. My son did not call. Not at Easter, not on my birthday in June, not at Thanksgiving. The silence was total and deliberate, and, after the first few months, I stopped waiting for it to break. I had Claire, I had Sunday dinners, I had Emma calling me Grandpa Robert, somewhere around month 4 in the offhand way children attach names to people they've decided belong to them. I had a life that was smaller than the one I'd lived before, and more real than anything I'd had in 20 years. And then, 14 months after Nathan had told me not to call him anymore, he called me. I was in Howard and Margaret's backyard helping Howard plant tomatoes, a skill I'd learned from Margaret the previous spring, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I looked at the screen and felt something drop in my stomach. Not dread exactly, something closer to bracing. "I'll be right back," I told Howard. And I walked to the far end of the yard and answered. Nathan's voice was different from the last time I'd heard it. Quieter. The precision was still there, but the edge underneath it was softer, or maybe just more tired. He asked how I was. I told him fine. He asked about Portland. I said it had grown on me. Then the real reason. Diana's parents had offered to help them with the property investment, he said. Not 80,000 this time. He was quick to make the adjustment, which told me he'd thought about this call more like 45. He'd been doing well at his job. He had a solid plan. He just needed a bridge to get through the next quarter, and he thought, given the time that had passed, given that he'd had time to reconsider some things, maybe we could talk. I watched Howard pressing soil around a tomato plant 50 feet away. He glanced up at me once, took one look at my face, and returned his attention to the garden without comment. "Nathan," I said, "I'm glad you called. I mean that." He said nothing, waiting, "But I can't give you the money." The silence stretched long enough that I checked the phone to see if the call had dropped. "I figured," he said finally. "I told Diana you'd say that. I'm not saying it because I don't care about you," I said. "I'm saying it because I've learned the hard way that money is what we use when we don't know how to say the real thing. And I don't think what's between us is actually about money." Another silence. Different texture to this one. "Then what is it about?" I thought about how to answer honestly without saying too much. "It's about the fact that I don't actually know you anymore. And I'd like to. But writing you a check doesn't get us there." He said he appreciated that. His voice said he didn't, or didn't know what to do with it. We talked for another 5 minutes about nothing in particular: his job, the Nashville project, a brief mention of the kids that made my chest tighten because I had grandchildren I'd barely met. When we hung up, I stood at the edge of Howard's garden and felt the full, complicated weight of it. I was still holding the phone when Howard appeared beside me with 2 glasses of lemonade. "Son?" he asked. I said yes. He handed me a glass. "Same answer as last time?" I said yes to that too. Howard nodded slowly. "Good." He looked at the garden. "Those tomatoes need water. You want to do it? Or should I?" That was Howard. The tomatoes still needed water. Life had the grace to keep requiring things from you. Nathan didn't call again after that. Not for 4 years. Not when Claire got married in a small ceremony that I wept through from start to finish. Not when I retired fully from the consulting work I'd been doing part-time and settled into what I'd started calling, without embarrassment, my actual life. Not when Emma started middle school and declared with great authority that she was going to be a marine biologist. And not when she changed her mind 6 months later and announced she was going to be an architect instead. He didn't call when my brother passed, which was the one that nearly broke me, and Margaret sat with me on her porch for 3 hours without needing me to say anything coherent. He didn't call at Christmas, which I stopped spending alone after the first year because Margaret had made it simply impossible to be alone at Christmas within a half-mile radius of her house. He didn't call on my birthday, which Howard and Paul had taken to marking with a barbecue and increasingly ambitious homemade cake attempts that were more about enthusiasm than technique. 5 years passed the way good years do, not quickly exactly, but fully. Every day used up. Every Sunday counted. When Claire told me she was pregnant, I drove directly to Margaret's house and stood on the porch with a bottle of champagne I'd bought on the way and said, "I'm going to be a grandfather." And Margaret made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a cry, and Howard shook my hand and said, "Well, it's about time." When my grandson Thomas was born, I was in the waiting room with Claire's husband, Ben, and we held each other up in the particular way men do when they're overwhelmed and trying not to show it and have given up on hiding it entirely. When Claire put that baby in my arms, I understood something about the nature of continuation that I hadn't fully grasped before. Something that made the years of loneliness feel not wasted, but necessary, like the soil that had to be turned before something could grow. Emma was 17 by then, and declared Thomas the best thing that had ever happened to our family, with the same complete authority she'd used to declare me acceptable company at age 9. Captain Biscuit had long since gone to whatever reward awaited faithful hamsters, but Emma had decided I was a permanent fixture in his absence, which felt like an honor of the highest order. I was at Margaret and Howard's house, helping Howard build a raised garden bed in the backyard, a project we'd been discussing for 2 years, and finally gotten around to when Claire called to tell me about the graduation. My grandson, Marcus, Nathan's son, my other grandchild, the one I'd met twice in 5 years at Claire's insistence, was graduating from high school. Claire had maintained quiet contact with Nathan over the years. She'd never pushed me toward reconciliation, and never pushed Nathan toward anything, but she'd kept a thread between the two households so fine I'd mostly pretended not to see it. She was inviting me to the graduation. She was also telling me, gently, the way Claire delivered hard information, that Nathan would be there. "Do you want to come?" she asked. "You don't have to. I understand if—" "I'll come," I said. Howard looked at me from behind a stack of 2x4s. I told him what the call was about. He set down his pencil and said, "Do you want Margaret and me to come with you?" I thought about it for a moment. "Would you?" "We'll be in the 3rd row," he said. "Right behind you." The graduation was held in the high school gymnasium on a Saturday afternoon in late May. Folding chairs and homemade signs, and the particular organized chaos of a ceremony that is deeply meaningful to the people inside it and invisible to everyone else. I arrived with Margaret and Howard and Claire and Ben, who was pushing Thomas in a stroller with the focused determination of a man navigating a steeplechase. Margaret put her hand through my arm as we found our seats. Howard sat on my other side. Claire squeezed my shoulder from behind. I saw Nathan before he saw me. He was standing near the entrance with Diana and a woman I didn't recognize, who turned out to be Diana's mother. He'd aged in 5 years in ways I recognized because I'd aged the same way gravity's slow editorial work on the face, the way anxiety settles into the jaw over time. He was scanning the room, and when his eyes reached our row, they stopped. I watched him process what he was seeing. Margaret holding my arm. Howard beside me with his steady, unhurried presence. Claire leaning over to say something to me. Thomas reaching up from the stroller to grab at my finger. Nathan's face did something complicated that I won't pretend I could fully read. There was surprise in it. And something else. The particular expression of someone who has been walking around with a certain story about another person and has just encountered evidence that the story was incomplete. Diana touched his arm. He said something to her, and then he walked toward us. I stood up. He stopped a few feet away, We looked at each other in the crowded gymnasium with a Sousa march playing tinnily from the speaker system and someone's toddler crying 3 rows over, and 5 years of silence pressed between us like a held breath. "Dad," he said. "Nathan." His eyes moved to Margaret, to Howard. He had questions in his face, but he didn't ask them yet. "This is Marcus's graduation," he said, which was not a question but was doing the work of one acknowledging that I had as much right to be here as anyone, testing whether that acknowledgement would cost him something. "I know," I said. "I wouldn't have missed it." Something moved across his face at that. He looked down briefly and then back up. "I didn't know you were coming. Claire invited me." He nodded. Then, because he was his father's son in ways I sometimes forgot. "Who are these people?" I turned slightly. "This is Margaret. And Howard. Their family." Nathan looked at them more carefully. Margaret smiled at him without warmth or coldness, simply present, simply honest. Howard gave a small nod that communicated both acknowledgement and the unmistakable message that he had my back, quietly and completely. "Family," Nathan repeated. "People who showed up," I said. "Not cruelly, just the truth, at the only volume it comes in." He was quiet for a moment. Around us, the gymnasium was filling. Folding chairs, scraping. Programs, rustling. On the floor below the risers, teachers were directing students into lines with the barely controlled urgency of people herding cats. "I handled things badly," Nathan said finally. The words came out like they cost him something, which they probably did. The money, the things I said. I knew it wasn't right. "Diana and I," he paused. "It doesn't matter. I wanted you to know. I know it." I looked at my son, 50 years old, or close to it, standing in a high school gymnasium, admitting to something he'd spent 5 years not admitting. I thought about the man he'd been when he was 9, the one who fell asleep on my shoulder in the car. I thought about all the ways I'd failed him that were real, and all the ways he'd failed me that were equally real. I thought about the checkbook I hadn't opened, the boundary I'd held, the life I'd built in the holding. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "That's all?" I looked at him steadily. "What would you like me to say, Nathan?" He exhaled. "I don't know. Something. That you forgive me. That we can. I don't know what we can do yet," I said honestly. "I know you're Marcus's father, and I'd like to know my grandson. I know Claire loves you, and I love Claire. I know that you said things that were hard to hear, and I said no to things that needed to be said no to, and we've both been living in the aftermath of that. I don't think we fix it in a gymnasium before a graduation ceremony." He almost smiled. The almost was real, it was his actual face returning for a moment. "No," he said. "Probably not. But we could have coffee," I said. "Sometime. If you want." He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Okay. Yeah, I'd like that." Diana appeared at his elbow then, and we had 30 seconds of careful introduction before the lights dimmed and the principal's voice came over the microphone, and everyone hurried to their seats. I sat between Margaret and Howard as Marcus walked across the stage in his cap and gown and shook the principal's hand and held his diploma up for the photograph, and I clapped louder than I probably should have for a boy I barely knew, but intended to know better. Claire reached forward and squeezed my shoulder. Howard put his arm around mine briefly in the way he did when he wanted to mark a moment without making a speech out of it. Afterward, in the parking lot, I found Marcus, before he disappeared into the crowd of celebrating families. He was tall, taller than Nathan, with Diana's coloring and what I hoped was my father's jaw. He looked at me with polite uncertainty, the way teenagers look at old men they're supposed to know. "I'm your grandfather," I said, which seemed obvious, but apparently needed saying. "Robert, your dad's father." "I know who you are," he said. He had a teenager's guard up, which was fair. "Dad talks about you sometimes." "Does he?" Marcus shrugged with the precision of someone communicating it's complicated without using those exact words. "He says, you're stubborn." "He's right," I said. "He also says you were right about the money thing. He doesn't say it exactly like that, but that's what he means." I looked at this boy who was entirely a stranger, and entirely my blood, and felt something settle quietly into place. "Your dad was trying to fix something," I said. "He just picked the wrong tool." Marcus considered this. Is that what adults call it? That's what this adult calls it. He almost smiled. The same almost that Nathan had produced an hour earlier, and I recognized it with the full force of something surfacing from a very long way down the shape of my own face in someone 35 years younger, the proof of continuation I hadn't known I was looking for. I have a grandfather, I said, as much to myself as to him. And I have an uncle, and an aunt, and a brother who's a 2-year-old terror named Thomas who will absolutely be following you everywhere once he figures out you exist. Marcus looked uncertain about the 2-year-old part, but willing to accept the rest. Cool, he said, which in the vocabulary of teenage boys translates roughly to, I receive this, and it matters to me even though I can't say so. That evening, after the ceremony and the parking lot goodbyes and the long drive back to Margaret and Howard's house where Kathleen had made dinner because of course she had, we sat around the table. The 6 of us, 7 if you counted Thomas, who sat in his high chair conducting experiments with mashed potatoes, and I tried to say what the day had been. I wasn't good at this. Howard was better at stillness. Margaret at the direct expression of large feelings. But they'd been asking me to say the grace for 3 years, and I'd gotten less terrible at it. I spent a long time, I said, believing that the family I was supposed to have had failed me, or that I'd failed it, or both, and I kept trying to figure out which one was true, like it would change something if I got the answer right. I looked around the table. What I didn't understand was that the question was wrong. It doesn't matter which way the failure went. What matters is what you do after, who you sit down with, who you choose to show up for when you don't have to. Margaret was looking at me with that expression she had not sentiment exactly, more like recognition. Howard had the small nod going, the one that meant continue. I said yes to a dinner invitation on Christmas Eve 5 years ago, I said. And that yes is why I have everything I have now. The whole life. All of it. Because I was lucky enough to be in the right diner at the right time, and a woman I'd never met decided I was worth inviting to her table. I looked at Margaret, and I was smart enough, just barely, to say yes. You were a mess, Margaret said warmly. Complete mess, I agreed. But you invited me anyway. We recognized you, she said, which was what she always said. The thing she'd said once that had settled somewhere in my chest and never left. That's all it was. Emma, 16 now and in possession of opinions about everything, said, "Can we eat now, Grandpa Robert?" I said yes. We ate. 3 weeks later, I drove to Nashville for coffee with Nathan. Just coffee. Just the 2 of us. In a place he chose that turned out to be a good choice. Quiet, good coffee. A window table. We talked for 2 hours and didn't fix anything. Didn't pretend to. We talked about Marcus and about Claire, and about what I'd been doing in Portland and what he'd been doing in Nashville, and slowly, carefully, like men handling something fragile, we talked about what had happened between us. He said he'd known about the money before he called, that he'd known it was a bad idea, and he'd convinced himself it wasn't. Diana's father had pushed him. He'd pushed back by going along. He was telling me this not as an excuse, but as an explanation, which are different things even if they sound the same. I told him I'd made mistakes too, real ones, not just his version of them, actual failures of presence and attention when he was young that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with why the money had happened. He listened to that harder than I expected him to. When we got up to leave, he held his hand out. A handshake, formal and deliberate, the way his grandfather used to do it. I saw the inheritance of that gesture, and it moved me in a way I didn't expect. "Same time next month?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "I'll be here." I drove back to Portland in a single day, which was too much driving and probably not wise for a man my age, but I wanted to get home. I wanted to sit at Margaret and Howard's table on Sunday and tell them it had gone all right. I wanted to see Thomas and hear what new word he'd learned. I wanted to help Howard with the garden, which had finally produced tomatoes the previous summer and would do it again this year with any luck. I wanted to be where I was wanted. That's all any of us want, when you get down to it. Not blood, not obligation, not the complicated arithmetic of who owes what to whom. Just to be somewhere that chose you. Just to sit at a table where the invitation was real. I learned that on Christmas Eve in a diner on the east side of Portland, from a woman with silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head, who saw a man eating alone and decided he was worth the trouble of walking over. I've been at her table ever since, and I am not going anywhere.